In 1875, architectural preservation became law across Western Europe and the United States. Buildings were catalogued. Protections were written. Societies formed to defend historic structures from demolition. But the largest buildings, grand hotels, train terminals, exhibition halls, had already been disappearing for 30 years. Between 1840 and 1870, more monumental civic architecture was demolished in major cities than in the previous 2 centuries combined. And no one tried to stop it. There were no preservation movements, no public outcry, no legal framework to prevent the loss. The buildings came down without resistance. And then, suddenly, the resistance appeared. This is an investigative documentary. We're examining historical patterns through architecture, infrastructure, and institutional timing. Some viewers interpret these patterns through the lens of Tartaria, a term used in old maps that some now apply to unexplained architectural consistency. We're not making claims. We're presenting observations and letting you decide what they mean. The official explanation is straightforward. Cities modernized. Old buildings became obsolete. New construction required space. Preservation movements emerged as a response to loss, a natural cultural evolution triggered by regret. That timeline makes sense. Until you look at what was demolished when it was demolished and what replaced it. In 1851, London's Crystal Palace housed the Great Exhibition. It was the largest enclosed structure ever built, over 990,000 square feet of glass and iron, assembled in 9 months. It could hold 100,000 people. It was dismantled in 1854. In New York, the original Pennsylvania Station opened in 1910. It was modeled after Roman baths with vaulted ceilings and travertine columns. It covered 2 full city blocks. It was demolished in 1963. But the pattern starts earlier. In the 1840s, cities across the United States and Britain began tearing down what they called old stock. Large masonry buildings, often neoclassical, often with no clear construction records. These weren't medieval ruins. They were functional structures. Customs houses, market halls, hotels, hospitals. They were replaced with smaller buildings. Brick commercial blocks. Wood frame row houses. Simpler designs. The new construction was denser but lower. More units, less volume per unit. Philadelphia's Merchants Exchange was one of the largest domed buildings in North America when it opened in 1834. By 1850, there were proposals to demolish it for a commercial development. The building survived, but dozens of similar structures didn't. In Boston, the Tremont House, a luxury hotel opened in 1829 with indoor plumbing and gas lighting, was torn down in 1894. It had been obsolete for years, they said. But the replacement was a department store, not a newer hotel. A commercial building with a completely different function. That shift happened repeatedly. Grand civic buildings demolished. Retail or industrial structures built in their place. The demolitions weren't random. They followed a pattern. They targeted buildings with high ceilings, ornamental stonework, symmetrical facades, central atriums, load-bearing masonry walls thicker than structural need required. The buildings felt over-engineered, and they were everywhere, not just in capitals, in regional hubs, in towns that were small during the supposed construction dates. Buffalo, New York, had monumental grain elevators and a neoclassical city hall by the 1870s. The population was under 120,000. The elevators could store grain for a city of 500,000. Richmond, Virginia, had a state capitol designed by Thomas Jefferson in 1788. The building could house a legislature 3 times the size of the one that met there. These weren't isolated cases. Across the eastern United States and industrial England, infrastructure appeared before the population that would justify it. And then, in the mid-19th century, much of it started coming down. The first preservation law in Britain was the Ancient Monuments Protection Act of 1882. It protected prehistoric sites, stone circles, burial mounds, ruins. It did not protect buildings from the 18th or early 19th century. Those buildings had no legal defense. In the United States, the first federal preservation effort was the Antiquities Act of 1906. It focused on Native American sites and natural landmarks, not civic architecture, not the buildings being demolished in every major city. The protection came later, after the loss had already occurred. Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate, was saved by a private preservation society in 1858, but only after years of lobbying. It was nearly sold for development. If Mount Vernon required a campaign, what happened to buildings with no famous owner? They disappeared. And no records explain why so many came down in such a short window. Between 1840 and 1880, American cities demolished an estimated 60% of their pre-1830 monumental architecture. The figure is higher in Britain. The demolitions slowed after 1880. That's when preservation movements formed. But by then, the largest examples were already gone. What remains are the smaller pieces. The buildings that survived because they were repurposed or remote or privately owned. The pattern is visible in before and after city photography. In the 1850s, daguerreotypes show streetscapes dominated by stone buildings with uniform height and classical proportions. By the 1890s, those same streets are lined with narrow brick facades and irregular rooflines. The transformation happened in a single generation. And it happened simultaneously across multiple regions with no centralized coordination. Boston's old Custom House. New York's original City Hall. Chicago's first Board of Trade building. All demolished between 1850 and 1880. All replaced with buildings that had shorter lifespans. The question isn't whether cities modernize. They do. The question is why the modernization required removing the most durable structures and replacing them with less permanent ones. And why preservation only became urgent after the removal was nearly complete. The Erie Canal opened in 1825. It ran 363 miles from Albany to Buffalo, connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie. It was the longest canal in the Western Hemisphere. It required 83 locks, 18 aqueducts, and the excavation of over 12 million cubic yards of earth. The population of New York State in 1825 was 1.6 million. The canal could move 400,000 tons of freight per year, more than the entire state produced at the time. It was built for a demand that didn't exist yet. And it wasn't alone. In the same decade, Britain was building a national railway network. By 1850, England had over 6,000 miles of rail track. The infrastructure preceded industrial demand in most regions. Small towns received stations designed for thousands of daily passengers. They served hundreds. Warehouses were built along rail lines in rural areas where no goods were stored. Grain elevators appeared in farming communities that couldn't fill them. The systems were complete before the economy required them. The official explanation is foresight. Governments and private investors anticipated growth. They built infrastructure to encourage development. That makes sense in isolated cases. But the scale was uniform. And the timing was compressed. Between 1820 and 1860, the United States and Britain constructed thousands of miles of canal and rail, hundreds of central water systems, citywide gas lighting networks, standardized postal systems, public hospital networks, municipal fire departments with identical organizational structures. These systems appeared in the same 40-year window, across 2 continents, with nearly identical administrative frameworks. And they all required a level of coordination that official records don't fully explain. Take water infrastructure. Philadelphia's Fairmount Waterworks began operation in 1815. It used steam-powered pumps to distribute clean water through a city-wide pipe network. The system could serve 400,000 people. Philadelphia's population in 1815 was 112,000. The same pattern appeared in Boston, New York, and London. Massive water systems built decades before the population justified the capacity. The pumping stations looked like temples. Neoclassical columns, vaulted interiors, decorative stonework far beyond functional need. They were engineered for a future population, or they were repurposed from something that already existed. The question is which interpretation fits the evidence. Railway stations present the same problem. London Street Pancras Station opened in 1868. The train shed was the largest single-span structure in the world, 240 feet wide with no internal supports. It could handle 120 trains per day. In 1868, it handled 30. The station featured a Gothic Revival hotel with 300 rooms, hydraulic lifts, and fireproof floors. The construction cost was over £1 million, equivalent to roughly £100 million today. For a station that served a fraction of its capacity. The same pattern appeared in smaller cities. Bristol Temple Meads, Manchester Piccadilly, Glasgow Central, all built with capacities far exceeding traffic projections. all designed with monumental architecture that had no operational purpose. The stations weren't just functional, they were performative, and they all appeared within a 20-year span. In the United States, the pattern intensified. Grand Central Depot opened in New York in 1871. It was replaced by Grand Central Terminal in 1913, not because the original was too small, but because the design was considered outdated. The 1871 building could handle 100 trains per day. Traffic in 1871 averaged 40. Chicago's Union Station, Baltimore's Mount Royal Station, Washington's Union Station, all built with excess capacity, all featuring monumental stone facades and vaulted waiting halls. The architecture suggested permanence, but many were demolished within 70 years. Grain elevators followed the same logic. Buffalo's grain storage capacity in 1870 was 4 million bushels. The city handled 1.2 million bushels annually. The elevators were cylindrical concrete towers, 120 feet tall, grouped in clusters along the waterfront. They were built using slip-form concrete techniques that wouldn't become standard until the 20th century. The structures dominated the skyline, and they sat mostly empty. The official explanation is speculative construction. Investors built ahead of expected demand, but that requires consistent overinvestment across dozens of cities, in multiple infrastructure categories, over several decades. All without coordination. All using similar designs. All exceeding demand by the same proportions. Postal systems show the same compression. In 1840, Britain introduced the penny post, a standardized national mail system with prepaid postage and universal delivery. Within 5 years, the system was handling 350 million letters annually. But the infrastructure was already in place. Post offices, sorting facilities, delivery routes, standardized schedules. The system launched fully operational. There was no gradual buildup, no testing phase, no regional pilots. It appeared complete. The United States adopted a similar system in 1847. By 1855, the postal network covered 240,000 route miles and employed 28,000 people. The administrative structure was identical to Britain's. The uniforms, the sorting protocols, the delivery schedules. Two nations, same system, same timeline. Street lighting followed the same pattern. London's gas lighting network was installed between 1807 and 1823. By 1823, over 40,000 gas lamps lit the city. The network required underground pipes, distribution hubs, and coordinated maintenance schedules. It appeared citywide in less than 2 decades. Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Boston installed identical systems in the same window. Same technology, same implementation speed, same administrative structure. The gas was produced in centralized plants, distributed through cast iron mains, regulated by municipal authorities using standardized contracts. The systems were interchangeable, and they all emerged simultaneously. Fire departments show the clearest administrative convergence. In the 1850s, major cities across the United States and Britain reorganized volunteer fire brigades into professional municipal departments. The reorganization happened within a 5-year span. The departments adopted identical rank structures, equipment standards, response protocols, alarm systems, station designs. In 1853, Cincinnati established a paid fire department with steam-powered pumpers and telegraphic alarm boxes. In 1865, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago had adopted the exact same model. Not similar, identical, down to the rank insignia. The speed suggests either extraordinary coordination or the adoption of a pre-existing template. Official records credit individual municipal reforms, but the uniformity indicates a shared source. Whether that source was inherited, copied, or independently developed in parallel, the evidence doesn't clarify. What remains is the pattern. Massive infrastructure, built before demand, administered through identical frameworks, demolished or repurposed within decades, and preserved only after the largest examples were already gone. The word Tartaria appears on European maps from the 15th through the 19th centuries. It referred to the vast region of Central Asia controlled at different times by Mongol, Turkic, and Russian powers. The term was geographical, not political. It described territory, not a unified civilization. By 1850, the label had mostly disappeared from cartography. Modern interest in the term began in the early 2000s, when researchers examining old maps noticed the scale of the territory marked Tartaria, and began asking why such a large region had no surviving centralized records, no clear successor state, and no unified architectural legacy in historical accounts. Some interpreted the absence as evidence of deliberate erasure. Others saw it as a mapping convention that was eventually replaced by more specific regional names. A third group began connecting the label to architectural patterns that didn't fit conventional timelines. They noticed the same things we've examined: infrastructure built before apparent demand, administrative systems appearing fully formed, and monumental architecture demolished during the exact period when preservation should have begun. They called it the Tartarian hypothesis. Not a claim, a framework. One interpretation suggests that Tartaria represents a previous phase of advanced infrastructure, either inherited from an earlier civilization or built during a period of greater coordination than official records indicate. Under this view, the demolitions of the 1840s, 1880s were not modernization but replacement. The preservation movements emerged not in response to loss, but after the replacement was complete. A second interpretation treats Tartaria as a metaphor. The term represents the pattern itself, the architectural and infrastructural consistency that appeared across regions, seemed over-engineered for its time, and was systematically removed before being formally protected. In this reading, whether a literal Tartaria existed matters less than the observable fact that something was built, used briefly, and then dismantled. A third interpretation rejects both. It argues that the patterns reflect normal industrial expansion, investment speculation, and the natural cycle of urban development. The demolitions were economic. The preservation movements were cultural responses to modernization. The architectural similarities were the result of shared European design traditions and the spread of neoclassical education. All three interpretations engage the same evidence. The difference is in what they emphasize. The first asks, why was so much capacity built in advance? The second asks, why was so much removed so quickly? The third asks, why do we expect anything different? The year 1816 offers a focal point. It's known as the year without a summer. A volcanic eruption in Indonesia caused global climate disruption. Crops failed across Europe and North America. Famine and disease followed. Population records show significant mortality. Economic records show collapse in agricultural output. But infrastructure records show something else. In the decade after 1816, construction accelerated. The Erie Canal was authorized in 1817. London's gas lighting expanded rapidly. New railway charters were issued across Britain. Major urban water systems began operation. The post-1816 construction boom happened during a period of widespread depopulation and economic contraction. The official explanation attributes this to recovery and reinvestment. But the infrastructure that appeared wasn't recovery scale. It was expansion scale. Built as if the population had grown, not shrunk. That timing sits at the center of multiple interpretations. Some see it as evidence of inheritance, systems that were already present being repurposed or reactivated after a collapse. Others see it as speculative overbuilding during a chaotic period when oversight was weak and records were incomplete. Others see it as exactly what the records say, ambitious recovery projects by forward-thinking governments. The evidence supports elements of all three. What it doesn't support is certainty. When people use the term Tartaria, in this context, they're not naming a lost empire. They're naming a gap. The gap between the scale of what was built and the population it was built for. The gap between the durability of the construction and the brevity of its use. The gap between the uniformity of the systems and the lack of centralized coordination in the records. Whether that gap represents inheritance, speculation, or simply aggressive expansion, the architecture remains, and so does the timing. Preservation movements didn't begin until after the demolitions were nearly complete. Legal protections didn't extend to the largest structures until they were already gone. The buildings that survived were the ones repurposed, isolated, or privately defended. What was lost wasn't just architecture. It was context. The buildings that came down had no construction records, no architect attributions, no clear dates. They were referenced in civic documents as the old customs house or the original market hall. Old relative to what? Original compared to when? The preservation movements of the 1880s cataloged what remained. They didn't investigate what had been removed. And by the time institutional historians began asking those questions, the physical evidence was gone. What we're left with are photographs, land surveys, and the structures that survived because they were too remote, too useful, or too privately owned to demolish. The pattern is visible. The interpretation is open. Some call it Tartaria. Others call it speculative infrastructure. Others call it the natural rhythm of industrial transition. The evidence doesn't resolve the debate. It invites examination. And it asks a simple question. If these buildings were always meant to be temporary, why did they build them to last?